to let the audience know that you can use the chat functions and the Q&A function on Zoom to send in your questions, but we will address the questions at the end of the sessions. You're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to the speakers. So let's get started with our first speaker, who is Professor Nick Clear, who is an architect, writer, and curator, and professor and head of the Department of Architecture and 3D Design at the University of Huddersfield. He was professor of architecture and head of Department of Architecture and Landscape at University of Greenwich. Professor Clear joined the University of Greenwich, having taught at the Bartlett School of Architecture for over 20 years. In 2015, he was the inaugural professor at Research in Visionary Cities at the Institute of Fine Arts in Vienna. He has been at the forefront of the use of moving images in architecture for over 20 years. The title of his paper today is Synthetic Spaces, Creating Narrative Architectures with 3D Digital Scanning. Thank you, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm just getting my presentation up. Thanks very much. It's really, really nice to be here, although of course none of us are actually here. But I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to present some of the research work that I've been doing over the last couple of years with a colleague of mine, Hyun Jun Park, which started at the University of Greenwich but has continued at the University of Huddersfield. In the year since the last conference was last kind of expected to happen, I've actually become Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities. So I've had a promotion in that time. The slides that I'm going to be showing during the presentation won't directly align with the text, but they'll go through the process of the developing that we went through developing the work for the Synthetic Spaces exhibition, which will be the main focus of this paper. In this paper, it will be argued that the recent developments of 3D laser scanning technology offer important opportunities to expand the ways in which architects are able to capture and represent physical spaces, providing unique and innovative methods to communicate narrative spatial concepts that combine quantitative surveying approaches with the visual storytelling techniques of filmmaking. The paper will outline a brief account of 3D laser scanning technology as it is used in the mapping of physical space, and show how laser scanning offers great accuracy, but also affords further possibility to develop narratives around the way in which spaces are represented. I will then focus on aspects of recent research that I have developed with my colleague Hyun Jun Park that uses laser scanning to explore spatial narratives, combining the dissemination of this material through exhibitions and installations. In particular, the use of 3D laser scanning as part of a practice-based research project to capture and construct detailed digital point cloud models of 3 sites in Huddersfield, and to use the data to create artworks, including an immersive installation and composite drawings, to explore narrative and experiential aspects of those sites. A project that was conceived to kickstart a larger research investigating the spatial transformations that are taking place in our cities and towns through the creation of cognitive maps that operate in the synthetic space between indexical forms of acquisition and non-linear forms of production and representation, exploring concepts of spatial representation, spatial experience, and spatial practice, as described by the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre in his production of space. Architecture has a long history of using technical apparatus to capture information about spaces through various surveying techniques. From artistic methods such as perspective grids and the camera obscura to photographic and more conventional measured cartographic approaches. All of these have strengths and limitations based on their ability to accurately produce site information that can be manipulated. Traditional drawn and modeled surveys take data directly from the site, but abstract it into orthographic representations. Photographic and film surveys capture pictures of sites, but do not allow a quantifiable way to describe the site, except perhaps for recent developments in photogrammetry, which I will not be discussing here. The term laser scanning itself refers to a number of different processes and can be used in many different ways. In this presentation, I am specifically referring to 3D laser or LiDAR scanning facilitated by commercial scanning equipment such as those developed by Faro, Trimbo, and Leica. For this work, we've been using a proprietary 3D scanner by Faro called a Faro Focus. There's no question that scanning offers great accuracy, greater than conventional approaches, but it also offers opportunities to combine the data with other forms of practice, particularly animation. With 3D laser scanning, the data is collected directly from the site and therefore retains an indexical relation to that site. The information can be translated into data for conventional surveying purposes and used for more speculative narrative purposes. The laser scanning process produces digital data in the form of an evocative point cloud model. The purpose of this data is often considered as an intermediary in producing an objective survey of the physical site. There are, however, many variables where judgments of the operator can be an important factor. From these types of scans, it is possible to create very accurate site surveys, translate the data from a point cloud model to editable mesh models from which conventional survey information can be obtained, to create immersive VR models of a space, to develop high-resolution digital photographs, and create animations that are point of view independent. The scanning process consists of hardware, a scanning device, a specialist software that allows the multiple scans to be aligned, and the composite scan to be conformed. Scanning works by the scanning device sending out laser pulses that are reflected back that are then used to create a 3D spatial map represented by points in space, hence the name point cloud. The scanning process can be quite laborious as the scanner can only capture surfaces in its line of sight, and to capture complex spaces, multiple scans have to be performed. This requires in itself time and planning if the scans to achieve a level of completeness. Multiple scans have to be made to avoid blind spots. The software aligns the scans to give a complete representation of the space. Generally, there are 3 phases to each scan. The first scan establishes the point cloud data. The second fixes the telemetry of the data, fixing the distances of the points in space. The third scan takes a high resolution digital image that is then mapped onto the point cloud. As well as the technical complexities of using the scanner, laser scanners are expensive, although the price is dropping, and point cloud information is very data heavy and requires a powerful CPU to be able to do the processing. These constraints are limiting the availability beyond professional and academic users. Developments such as LiDAR scanning on portable devices, such as on the iPhone Pro, is making the technology more available. While scanning is often seen as a quantitative methodology, there are decisions during those processes that affect the aesthetic nature of the final scan. And with additional photo editing, color grading, and post-production, this can be greatly enhanced, as will be discussed later. The combination of using real-world data and virtual functionality has led me to use the term synthetic space, due to both the spaces being a synthesis of virtual and actual, alongside the implied meaning of something that is created as an imitation of the natural. The point cloud model's hybridity sits between a representation and a simulation. It is a virtual model and can be explored as such, but it is also a direct mapping of the actual, though not in the same way that we might think of the traditional indexical links in photography or cinema. Laser scanning creates models where views need to be rendered in a fashion similar to conventional 3D modeling software, and offers the opportunity to use animation techniques and post-production processes with editing and sound used to articulate complex spatial narratives and address historical, cultural, and social dynamics. The aesthetic implications of the point cloud model are an important aspect to its appeal, as scans can look very evocative. Once the data are acquired, the scan offers an opportunity to explore that world in a manner that is not constrained by real-world limitations such as gravity and materiality. My interest in 3D scanning dates back nearly 20 years to the time when I was teaching at University College London, when a colleague of mine showed me some images that were taken inside a nuclear reactor. The images have an uncanny quality that is made more powerful once you realize that it is an image that can never be physically seen. At that time, I was using conventional film and animation as part of my teaching and research, and the potential of this technology was immediately apparent, even if the economic and technical considerations were at that time an obstacle. At the University of Greenwich, as the head of Department of Architecture and Landscape, I was able to acquire a scanner for my department and started working with Hyun Jun Park to scan parts of the old Royal Naval College and other historic buildings in the area. We also used scanning to develop research with other colleagues and explored different and unusual types of research, such as documenting tree pit studies. At this stage, the type of research fell into more conventional modes of how scanning is predominantly used to document, record, and archive. With the ability to use the scanner to record exhibitions and installations was a very useful means in the way in which we were able to disseminate access to those events. The research opportunities of 3D scanning have been further enhanced since my arrival at the University of Huddersfield. The research that Hyun and I have produced, working under the name Clear and Park, has evolved into a form of art practice, where the focus of the work is to produce work specifically for installations and exhibitions. The Synthetic Spaces project was initiated with an invitation to exhibit in the Market Gallery in Huddersfield. Even though the lead into the exhibition was only 2 months, it was decided that rather than exhibiting existing scans, this would be an opportunity to create new work featuring sites in Huddersfield. 3 of the town's iconic landmarks were chosen as the subjects for the show. Castle Hill, a Victorian folly that overlooks the town, the railway station, a Grade 1 listed building that acts as the gateway to the town for many of its visitors, and the Queensgate Market, an extraordinary piece of 1970s brutalist architecture that has fallen somewhat into neglect in recent years. Synthetic Spaces attempted to show that laser scanning, combined with specially designed soundscapes, can be used to create evocative spatial representations that take the form of narrative portraits of the sites. The exploration of these 3 sites was achieved through the creation of an immersive animation and the development of complex layered images displayed on light boxes. These represented cognitive maps and were understood as visual articulations of Lefebvre's conceptions of the social production of space, in that they embody the measured, the experienced, and the practiced. Conventional photography was initially used to map out an idea of what was required and to create a production schedule for the exhibition. The design of the exhibits took into consideration the type of access available for each site, the time it would take to capture and process the scan data, as this would determine the final resolution of the work. The nature of physically scanning each of the sites also gave strong indicators as to how the animation paths and the editing of the sequences was to be constructed, as these gave an impression of how the spaces are performed. Once the parameters were fixed, the production of the work was quite systematic. The scans were undertaken, test images developed, including the production of a series of composite images or chronograms, as shown here and in the previous two slides. For each site, these were created as concept images for the animation sequences. Once complete, the stills and animated sequences were rendered off, the videos edited and graded, and a soundtrack for the sequence was composed, which reinforced the themes of how our perceptions of spaces are composed of shifting layers, operating through highly subjective conceptions of time. An important element of the soundtrack was samples taken from a Yorkshire television documentary from 1972, Home James, which followed the actor James Mason's return to Huddersfield. The difference between the version of the town represented in this documentary, vestiges of which still linger in the town's own mythos, and the post-industrial reality of the contemporary town is an important element in the project. The Market Gallery exhibition consisted of 2 rooms, one for the video installation and one containing the 2D renders and the chronograms that were displayed on the light boxes. For subsequent exhibitions, additional site drawings were constructed to give more regional and local context, and the animations were shown on 3 separate screens. Were shown on 3 separate screens as a video triptych. The works produced for the original Synthetic Spaces exhibition has been featured in a number of other exhibitions, lectures, presentations, and written works. The drawings and films have been shown at an exhibition in Auckland and at 2 exhibitions in China, winning Best Project for the CSEC Biennale in Yunnan and as part of the Shanghai Urban Space Art Season. 4 of the composite images have also been on continuous display in the various commercial properties in Huddersfield's town centre at the request of Kirklees Council since the exhibition in September 2019. The project was presented at a keynote lecture at Leeds School of Architecture Symposium on Film and Architecture, Scene and Sequence on Cinematic Urbanisms, with a version of that presentation also shown at a symposium in Huddersfield on perspective. A more focused presentation about the use of laser scanning was also the subject of a paper submitted at the RIBA Research Matters Conference at the University of Nottingham. This piece was expanded into a public lecture and given as part of the exhibition in Auckland. Synthetic Spaces was published as part of a catalogue for the CSEC Biennale and as a book chapter on exhibition practice published in
3 minutes left. 3 minutes
in August 2020. Thanks very much. All of these activities were recently collated as part of the Research Excellence Framework and were submitted as a research portfolio. Synthetic Spaces was also the starting point of a number of other projects, looking at the use of scanning technology to tell stories about spaces, both within Huddersfield, particularly the George Hotel, the birthplace of rugby league, but also in other areas as well. Current projects include an animation of Virginia Woolf's garden in East Sussex to be read alongside excerpts from her novel, The Waves, and an animation of a recently restored Barbara Hepworth sculpture originally commissioned for the Festival of Britain. The purpose of this presentation is that synthetic spaces demonstrates both the potential of laser scanning to transform the way in which we document, explore, and represent spaces. And while scanning is mainly used for currently used for conventional surveying purposes, the project shows how data generated by point cloud models can facilitate the creation of immersive and experiential forms of aesthetic output. As representations, the images carry with them the technical veracity of the original scans and the incorporeal aesthetic possibilities of editable digital data. The effect of these visualizations is to capture the elusive and uncanny qualities of these Huddersfield sites as it is caught between its industrial past and the uncertainties of its current status. The ineffability of these images is an ideal medium to express the liminal qualities typical of many of the spaces of the contemporary city. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, right on time. Thank you, Professor Clear. Our next presenter is Dr. I think I'm kind of switch off. Dr. Gerald Stern, who worked at the Frei Otto's Institute for Lightweight Service Structures in Stuttgart, Germany. After graduation, after 2 years at the National Building Research Institute in Pretoria, South Africa. He entered practice as an architect in 1980, specializing in low-cost housing and medium density residential projects. He joined the Department of Architecture at Tashwane University of Technology in 1999 and the Department of Building Sciences in 2017. The title of his paper today is Tradition, Space, and Architectural Practice in Democratic South Africa.
Yes. Thank you, Cecilia. Can you hear me? It looks a bit muddled on this side.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, lovely stuff. Thank you very much. Listen, we've all been involved with virtual events for the last year and a half, but I must say that this IASTI conference is next level when it comes to organization, responsiveness, support, attention to detail. You know, that they really did very well here. That's the first thing I want to share with you. The other thing is that my studio is on a very busy street. So as it was, we had a police helicopter overhead for most of the morning. So I recorded my PowerPoint presentation on Camtasia. So what you get is my voice, my quirks, and my South African accent. But what you don't get is the passing traffic and the police sirens. So if I can share my screen, and I hope it is visible now.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, it's a video, so it's not a very long one. So let's go. My ideas on tradition, space. Good day, colleagues and friends. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you my ideas on tradition, space, and architectural practice in democratic South Africa. The presentation will broadly follow this sequence. The arrival of democracy in 1994 brought about a radical paradigm shift, powered by the transformation of every conceivable aspect of the profession. Now, Black architects, many with European qualifications, started practicing and essentially took over leadership of the professional bodies. Transformation of the profession and defining architecture with an African identity became hotly debated topics and still are. This triangular diagram represents the interrelated elements under study. My presentation explores the nature of and interrelationships between historical spatial practices and contemporary architectural practice, as well as the role of background and education as a bridge between these two extremes. The information for the study was partly derived from a broader and ongoing research project that aims to describe and analyze African perceptions of space, territory, privacy, and aesthetics in an age of globalization. Since white academics have been dominating the debate on Afrocentricity in architecture, 20 prominent practicing Black architects were interviewed. I engaged with other Black architects in their capacity as my peers. The first element under discussion is the pre-colonial spatial tradition. The award-winning Black South African architect, Phil Moshabane, said simply that African architecture is about place and placemaking, and that is defined by cultural hierarchy. In fact, it was found that Black architects tend to use the terms tradition, culture, and space almost interchangeably. The architectural tradition consisting of a number of thatched huts around an open space is found all over most of sub-Saharan Africa. Accordingly, in the traditional architecture of South Africa's Bantu-speaking people, the real social space is the open to the sky courtyard. It is the center as the most important place in both cultural and functional terms. A comparison between a 19th century homestead and a contemporary compound shows that both consist of a central meeting place surrounded by houses. This planned configuration is known as the central cattle pattern, a conceptual spatial nexus identified and most notably espoused by Thomas Huffman at Wits University. I couldn't resist showing you this design by Norman Eaton from the 1950s. It is a homestead called Greenwood Village, situated in Pretoria. A sensitive but quite literal interpretation of the spatial nexus. Eaton traveled extensively throughout Africa and had a great admiration for all things African. The next element is the role of background and education. What is the situation currently? It is in the rural homesteads that the traditional spatial patterns still exist. But children who grow up in rural villages are unlikely to know of or eventually study architecture. Where they live, the community design and build everything themselves. However, the phenomenon of circular migration exposes many city dwellers to tradition. Every weekend, huge numbers of urban dwellers travel to rural areas to visit family, often in traditional ancestral villages. This means that many Black children are thoroughly familiar with the traditional spatial patterns. Without that exposure, students exhibit an immature understanding of traditional spatiality, tending to romanticize it somewhat. The current curriculum at our schools of architecture unquestionably needs serious expansion, enriched by excursions to rural areas. Even visits to the touristy traditional villages are better than just pictures. To illustrate my argument, I want to show you the design for a court of law by Hopalong Motswai when he was a final year student. He regularly visited his grandmother in the rural Limpopo province. In his design, the courtrooms are in conical shells resembling the tower at the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. Other functions are accommodated in L-shaped buildings, each with its own small court. A public gathering space is situated at the entrance of the complex. The whole is therefore composed of separate structures clustered along an internal street and is roofed over. This is a mature and informed abstract interpretation of traditional space. The third element is contemporary architectural practice. Once in practice, the young architect finds very little support for Afrocentric design. Our commercial buildings do not only compete with their neighbors, but with similar buildings in the financial districts all over the world. The tourist and cultural industries are more receptive. However, the competent interpretation of traditional space is difficult. Too often the result is well-intentioned but Disney-esque. This is a small airport by a white architect. I would like to briefly discuss 3 case study projects by Mashibani Rose Architects to illustrate how traditional spatial concepts can convincingly inform contemporary designs. The first 2 are examples of how courtyards, the heart of Africa's spatiality, can be articulated to suit different functions. The third serves to demonstrate the fundamental difference between architecture with an African identity and a more internationalized or simply Western architectural approach. In the first of these 3 case studies by Mashibani Rose, the courtyard of the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls near Johannesburg is spacious, permeable, and festive. It features canopies and pergolas along the edges to mark indoor-outdoor transitions. The second, the Hector Peterson Museum in Soweto, outside Johannesburg, commemorates the June 1976 Soweto student uprising. Here the courtyard is a solemn central void filled with the names of the approximately 700 students who died as a consequence of the uprising. Let's compare the essential differences between Afrocentric and Eurocentric architecture. The third of Mashibani Rose's case studies, the entry for the Pan-African Parliament Design Competition, represents most of the characteristics associated with African identity. These include the courtyard, the round debating chamber linked to the courtyard, the perimeter fence, pergolas, screens and canopies, and the irregular clustered plan form with frayed edges and materials that are rustic and rough to the touch. The entry by FBW Architects is extensively glazed, smooth, and taught in a contemporary internationalized idiom. There is also a central drum juxtaposed on a crescent-shaped monolithic block. The firm has offices in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, in addition to their offices in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. Their portfolio demonstrates that they are capable of designing in a distinctly Afrocentric way. However, here the approach was direct, similar to that shaping Western monumental architecture. Black people constitute roughly 80% of South Africa's population and whites less than 10%. Yet less than 10% of South Africa's registered architects are black. But white architects are also expected to design buildings with an African identity. A few of the interviewees did not believe white architects are capable of designing Afrocentric buildings. Interestingly, however, the majority of them agreed that the architect Peter Rich is able to do so. The Mapungubwe Interpretation Center was the winner in the category of culture at the 2009 World Architecture Festival. It should be pointed out that Peter Rich is known for his painstaking recording and drawing of traditional villages and their homesteads, and for his genuine appreciation and knowledge of indigenous cultures. In conclusion, the democratic dispensation in South Africa drastically changed both the institutions regulating and those commissioning architecture. In order to inform the pursuit of architecture with an African identity, indigenous building traditions have been foregrounded with a particular emphasis on spatial patterns. The dramatically new paradigm created exciting opportunities and challenges for those teaching as well as those practicing architecture. Because the needs of the South African society and built environment became so much more diverse, a much greater understanding of cultural, social, ethical, spatial, and aesthetic aspects is now demanded of practitioners, lecturers, students, and indeed of clients too. Finally, the agency of the profession to conserve and promote building traditions relies to a large extent on the promotion and implementation by Black academics and practitioners with support and encouragement of client bodies, especially institutional ones. With that, I thank you for your attentiveness. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Stern. So let's go to our next speaker, is Yanni Gunawan, who is the founder and head of research and design development at Center for Adaptation and Resilience Environment Design Studies. He was appointed as the head of design. I'm sorry, I think I have I mixed up apologize. She was appointed as the head of design laboratory at Architecture Department, Parahyangan Catholic University, Indonesia. In 2017, her article titled Rumah Adat Marapu of Indonesia's Sumbanis Vernacular was published in the book Habitats, Vernacular Architecture for a Changing Planet. Her current research project is Tectonic Culture and its relationship with learning by making. The title of her paper today is Crafting Tradition, Bridging Vernacular Society, Education and Professional Practice in Indonesia. Yanni, I apologize for the mistake in earlier in reading your bio. I'm really sorry about that.
It's okay. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all here, and thank you, IST committee, for organizing this amazing virtual event. Today, I'm going to draw attention to issues of tradition in architectural production, how it handed down from generation to generation in vernacular societies, how we learn architecture at schools, and examples of effort to reduce the gap of its transmission. Paul Oliver states, there is no traditional architecture. There is only architecture that embodies tradition. Furthermore, Paul Oliver describes tradition not just material culture, but as cultural heritage, consists of conditioned and learned activities handed down from one generation to the next, and that we should focus on the transmission of tradition. In the case of vernacular architecture, this architectural production is a know-how tradition practiced in their everyday life. They know how to knot a rattan rope, how to replace a rotten bamboo, how to choose a wood for main structure, and etc. Um, in contemporary architectural production, both in architecture education and professional practice, this know-how tradition is often seen as distant, a heritage practiced only by rural society, far away from the so-called modern society living in the urban setting. This view separates the practice of traditional architectural production and modern architecture. The gap is enhanced by the history of Indonesia's architecture education, which began before its independence, back in 1920s. The first school is established by the Dutch with curriculum adapted from Netherlands School of Architecture. This curriculum became the patron of many schools of architecture in Indonesia until now. So in this sense, as Michael Lyon stated, this education concept separates the architect and the builder, which in turn has brought the separation of the academy from the world around it and put the architect in the distance, especially in Indonesia. This paper proposed that learning by making is a pedagogy that can reduce the gap. Learning by making is not about training architects to be the builder, but it's about making architecture as an act of craft. Craftsmanship means the desire to do a job well, quoted Richard Sennett, a form-giving activity that focusing on the quality and requires adequate knowledge and technique of making things. It is not just a mindless procedure. It needs the craftsman's skill and sensitivity, and in vernacular point of view, this act of craft is considered as a cultural practice for a particular way of life. Stephen J. and Nelson, in their book titled Digital Vernacular, states that the loss is not simply the ability to create objects by hand, but also the soul that is expressed through the pleasure of making and the independence delivered through the process of mastering one's own craft. Architects cannot work alone. He or she at least need others to build. The architect often needs an entire army of surrogate hands, both in the studio and on the construction site, to execute his work. So in performing tradition, this section demonstrates the different ways of collaborations between architecture students, vernacular builders, and professional architect as collaborative craftsmen. 4 case studies are programmed. The 4 case studies that are shown here are programmed conducted at Department of Architecture, Parahyangan Catholic University in Bandung. The first is a space installation project. The second is gardener shelter. The third is bamboo shelter installation. And the last one is bamboo workshop as part of community development program initiated by Construye Identidad, a group of young architects from Peru, which collaborate with our university. So in the first case and second case studies, the local vernacular carpenter they are invited to our school, and they act as trainer in material workshop, wood and bamboo workshop. So architecture students acted as designer and trainee. Professional architects are design critics and lecturers are facilitators. The students here learned how to make wood joineries, butt joint, half lap joint, and mortise tenon used extensively in the wooden steel traditional houses in many parts of Indonesia. Due to the time limitation, the bamboo workshop is performed by only demonstrations. The bamboo craftsmen who live in Bandung City is invited to teach and demonstrate how to work with bamboo materials. Types of bamboo is potential and limitation, tools used, types of joinery, and the construction technique. The chosen bamboo joineries are bamboo joints with dowels and central double rafters used in roller shades as non-structural elements. So here we can see that architects, architecture students, and vernacular builders have their own roles. Architects, which is only design critic, they don't fully involved in the whole situations. They are just invited to do a critic. But here, the students, after the workshop, the material workshop, the students design and develop their design not based on visual traditional style of traditional building, but they are because of we teach only joinery, so the students are have more freedom to interpret the design. They manufactured, assembled the wood space installation by themselves with the supervision of 2 local vernacular carpenters. In the second case study, the shelter need to be transported from campus to the site. So the given task is to design a knockdown shelter that is able to be assembled in 1 day. This second year, students design the gardener shelter in components to be manufactured in campus with the help of local vernacular builder, and then transported to the site and assembled by the local vernacular builder with the help of the students. So there is a reverse role between students and local vernacular builders in the beginning and in the end of construction process, which certainly require good communication and collaboration to execute the job well. The third case study is a bamboo shelter installation in a village near the ocean in Middle Java. And here, the students act as designer, lecturer as mentor. No professional architects are involved. All lecturers and students are female, and the bamboo experts are male, 2 male. They are the villagers. We work together as builders. All of us work together as builders. We already, because the nature of the project, which is a 7-day construction process in the village, far from the capital city, we choose to erect 1 by 1 main structure models in Bandung campus with the help of Bandung bamboo craftsmen based on the design and make a detailed working drawing based on the 1 by 1 prototype. However, on the site, after discussion with the local vernacular builder, the villagers, several changes are made in the joinery of the main structure. And we choose to work with the local joinery that binds the weave bamboo to the beam. So there are all the 3 case studies have differences in construction process which influence the role of the 3 actors. Trial and error, which is a unique characteristic of know-how tradition, collaborations, and communications between students and local carpenters are common are a common occurrence. The last case study is a bamboo rainwater collector in the village, in the Sumba village, called Welewo. In this project, there are 12 participants from outside the village, a mixed group of architecture lecturer, architecture students, professional architect, industrial and interior designers from Indonesia, France, Germany, and Peru. The goal of the program is to build bamboo water collector designed and drawn by a German architecture student in collaboration with an architect from Peru. It is important to note that the design process is done virtually. The group of 12 participants can be seen as students of Sumbanis building tradition, while the villager acted as expert of the rainforest. The term expert and student are used here because the participants gain a lot of knowledge, wisdom, technique, and skill from the villagers about bamboo, from picking the right bamboo and rattan from the rainforest, how to prepare them to become building materials, splitting, making holes, joining, binding, using mostly traditional tools, using mostly parang, axe, manual drill, and saw. We also learn about the social and belief system embedded in the construction process of their house with a distinct tower-like roof. So in this particular program, different from the other 3 case studies, we don't buy materials from the store. We take the bamboo and the rattan from the forest, from the rainforest. So the process of taking materials from the forest are filled with communication and a certain sound. The most extraordinary findings are the rattan joinery used in their traditional houses, a skill found hundreds of years ago, handed down by their ancestors. The villagers are showing us how to make several rattan joineries, and one of them called Buffalo Knot, when the idea of using it in the water collector emerged. So after a short discussion on site, the water collector's nut and bolt joinery is changed into traditional rattan joinery. So you can, from the expert of the rainforest, you can see how they handle the material, not only structures, but they work the material with nobility. And the construction was a cooperation. They show us how to extract the rattan or the bamboo and use it in the right way. So from the explanation on the 4 learning by making case studies, it is apparent that architecture does not end in the drawing table. Thus, architects as craftsmen should not stop after handing the drawing to the construction worker. Students of architecture should learn from many local builders and the ability to construct with local cultural reference. Each local builder has their own uniqueness in dealing with materials and construction techniques. Therefore, vernacular builders should not be seen as distant or unequal. Instead, they should be treated with mutual respect as architects equal. They have the knowledge, the wisdom, and the skill that architects don't have. Learning by making together with local vernacular builders provides architecture students with the opportunity to learn new things in a totally different way. So this presentation suggests that learning by making in architecture education is a powerful bridge to protect the transmission of local tradition in the global context. The education of architects in this global era can be seen as one of the most powerful start in the attempt to reweaving architecture tradition between vernacular society who practice know-how tradition and students of architecture who eventually become professional architects. If architects stop designing using local tradition of architectural production, then without market demand, the skill, knowledge, technique, and livelihood of the vernacular builders will perish. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Yanni. It's an interesting paper. So now move on to our final presenter today, Geoffrey Keys, who is a senior lecturer in architecture at Nottingham Trent University, where he leads modules in architectural technology and teacher studio design. He holds RICS specialist designation as a certified historic building professional, qualifying him to complete grant-aided work for English Heritage and similar bodies. His architecture practice, Geoffrey Keys Associates, is listed on the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Crafts Register, as well as being a fabric advisor to the Dioceses of South Wales and Nottingham, where Geoffrey has sat on the advisory committee for the care of churches. The title of his paper is Heritage Teaching by Stealth, Integrating Conservation Architecture Learning into an Undergraduate Architecture Course. The paper is co-authored by with Dr. Tom Hughes. So,
okay, let me hope this looks right. Yes, can you see that?
yes, very clear.
Hi, so yes, I'm Geoffrey Keys. Thank you very much for inviting us to deliver this paper. I'll mention that you mentioned my background in sort of conservation and heritage, and I'll also mention it. Tom Hughes also has a background from English heritage, so we both have a love and a passion for historic buildings, but also for contemporary architecture. And very much this comes about in how do we marry those two things together. So the subtext of this talk we're about to give is heritage teaching by stealth. We're looking at how we can be integrating this kind of learning outside of having specific modules that are teaching it, so that in a sense, students are taking it on by osmosis. So I'm going to talk about the idea of why we're teaching conservation architecture at this level or feel it's important, and how we're teaching it at NTU. And then I'm going to hand over to Tom, who is going to specifically look into what we've been doing over the past 4 years to integrate this, in particular, into the Year 2 course. So I'm starting with a quote here. Architectural intervention in existing buildings is not seen to be central to the pedagogy of architectural education. This is very much how we feel that architects are graduating without any specific knowledge on heritage and how they need to be dealing with these buildings. And in a place like the UK, the rest of Europe, where we are immersed in history in a built form, it's impossible to not have to deal with them somehow as a built environment professional. So why do we feel that teaching conservation is crucial to the degree? Well, these infographics here from Historic England show how big an industry heritage is and how much money and how many jobs it brings into the UK economy. On the right, you'll notice that two of the largest parts of that are architectural and engineering activities and construction, which of course we are very much part of as architects. but I'd like to present the quote below from the same study that was done by Historic England. It can be estimated that there are a little over 5.4 million traditional buildings in England, all of which require specialist knowledge and skills. Plainly, this constitutes a very substantial volume of potential demand for traditional building craft skills and material inputs. And one of the problems is that we have lost a lot of these craft skills in the UK. They are growing again, fortunately, but from the point of view of architects, we have very little skill typically in our education. So why do we need a specialist kind of knowledge? Well, again, some sort of facts related to the UK in particular. There are over 500,000 listed buildings on the heritage lists in England. Any grant-aided work on listed buildings, so in particular important buildings where we're looking to get grants from the lottery fund, things like this, require an accredited professional architect or a surveyor. And again, any unauthorized work on a listed building is actually a criminal offense, although it happens all the time. So the accreditation that we have for being in this kind of position in the UK are basically through the RIBA and through the RICS. There are 3,000 architectural firms, 28,000 members with the RIBA, but there are only 400 practicing members with the specialist accreditation for historic buildings from the RIBA. Equally, in the RICS, we have 67,000 members working through as part of the RICS. Now, those aren't all building professionals, but within that large number, there are only 150 practicing members who have the accreditation for working on historic buildings, which is the accreditation I have. So if you see from that, unfortunately, the majority of professionals don't have the appropriate knowledge to work on historic buildings, as it's not a specific requirement. Another quote here that I think sums it up very concisely. The progress in the consciousness of architectural heritage is an indispensable tool for an establishment of an ideal architectural education. Topics of the education, such as design studio and construction, cannot be regarded as separated from the knowledge of architectural heritage. Therefore, the question is why we who are involved in architectural education give so little importance to this issue of incorporating heritage. So generally, how conservation is being taught within the architectural field, architectural degrees, tends to focus a lot on skill sets that are outside the undergraduate degree. So they're at master's levels, postgraduate levels, or they're specialist peripheral courses outside the main field, such as museum studies or maybe sustainable building conservation. In the UK, there are only 25 courses in architectural or building conservation that are accredited by the IHBC. None of these are specifically undergraduate related. Outside the UK, there are other schools that try to also incorporate an earlier integration beyond master's level with specialisms, but again, they do tend to be mostly at master's level. One particular one at the University of Genoa is an undergraduate degree in architectural restoration with a second-year studio with integrated design conservation. But again, these are not incorporating it specifically through the whole process of the undergraduate degree. And very often they're taught by conservation specialists who themselves don't come from an architectural design background. So at NTU, we have a 3-year undergraduate course leading to the B Arch. In that course, Tom Hughes leads the second-year architecture design studio. I teach on that. We also have some other modules such as context and tech, which I teach on, and we integrate these very specifically into what we do in studio. But beyond what we're doing in our design studio, there is a 2-year master's leading to the MArch. Both are accredited by the ARB and the RIBA In the master's level, there is an option to take a heritage and conservation module led by Gamal Abdelmonem in year 2. And that gives a broader view of heritage based around theory and policy using case studies. But again, there is no designated conservation training at the undergraduate level. So from this, I think you can probably see that we're saying there is a distinct lack of consideration for what is the consciousness that students may have regarding heritage in their undergraduate design studies. So this has been the inspiration for the work that Tom and I have been doing with the year 2 studio over the last 4 years in developing that. And we've been looking at this as an iterative process, observing and adapting it as we go along. In developing what we do, I think this quote here from a professor at Fayoum University in Egypt in regards to integrating heritage at the undergraduate level in architecture courses sums up what we're really doing at NTU. So I'll just take you through this and then I'm going to lead you over to Tom Hughes. So first is to integrate critically with the frameworks and heritage values that are important. Assist the student to understand the heritage significance before they do any intervention work through their research and analysis. Promote the mixed courses or other modules which overcome gaps between teaching and practice. Formulate a methodology that actually assesses the cultural significance of these heritage assets with local communities. Develop the students' abilities to research, investigate, understand, and analyze using creative thinking methods. And finally, identify the parties who are responsible and accountable for the conservation decisions. And so this is very much, which is at the heart of what we do here at NTU, in particular in year 2. And I'd like to now lead you over to Dr. Tom Hughes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. Jeffrey's going to keep sharing the slides, so we'll ask him to go on to the next one each time. So essentially, when Jeffrey and I started working together 4 years ago, we realized we had this shared interest and feeling that there wasn't enough conservation architecture in what we were doing, and that it wasn't really reflected, this need wasn't really reflected in the curriculum. So there's quite a lot of talk about, I suppose, about the curriculum in teaching and when is the appropriate time to start this kind of investigation, and it does tend to be pushed back later. So but our feeling was it's such an integral part of practice that we really need to get the idea across to students earlier in their education, so that it just becomes kind of normal, and hence the idea of introducing things by stealth. So without changing the curriculum, we realized what we need to do was make these conservation architecture projects, adaptive reuse projects, successful design studio projects, as any good design studio would be. And these here are sort of 5 principles, I suppose, of what I think makes a second-year architecture project engaging. So first of all, a clear and urgent set of needs to be met, I think, is important to get students kind of motivated and interested. An engaging and approachable challenge. So it has to be intellectually challenging for them, but that has to be approachable, i.e. not insurmountable for a second-year student who's right at the beginning of their career. There needs to be a body of knowledge to be skillfully integrated. So the studio has to bring together taught input from other modules and not just be seen as something that sits on its own. To give the students a sense of purpose in their future role, they need to understand why their input is important to the project that you're setting them. And finally, you need to think about the whole sort of sequence of their education and how these ideas are introduced to them in a meaningful way, so they build on each other rather than being separate and dissociated. So I'll return to that sort of slide at the end and show how hopefully that relates to what we've been doing. So next slide, Jeffrey, please. So our first kind of crack at this 4 years ago was to really try and ensure that we had a live and urgent project. So this old school hall in Sneinton, a project I was involved in from a community basis, was essentially to save this building, which was one of the oldest in the areas, from potential demolition that it was threatened to. It's one of the oldest institutional buildings in the area. It had been a community hall, funding had run out, the building was falling down, and demolition was really on the card. So there's a kind of urgency there. Next slide. So the other point of that was to introduce sort of live clients as new uses. So we introduced the students to a cafe owner and baker and a craftsperson who were looking for new space in the area. So to give them a real vision of how that space could be transformed by new kind of cultural practices, I suppose. Next slide. So what happened? Really, because the building was in a way quite ordinary, it wasn't listed, it didn't have a defined kind of heritage status. The students found it very difficult to sort of value that heritage appropriately. They tended to go one way or the other. So as you can hopefully see from some of these models from the exhibition at the end, which was a community exhibition held in a local pub, some of the students were very kind of respectful and little sort of add-on things, and others went to the opposite end of the scale and really kind of blitzed the existing thing and imposed something new. And there was very little subtlety between those two extremes. They did, however, the thing with the live clients, and especially the cafe, kind of introduced this clear set of brief requirements, which was something we wanted to hold on to the next time we tried this. Okay, next slide. So yeah, Strongest Schemes had the emphasis on that new kind of cultural transformation of the building, but we needed to balance more the understanding of the heritage architecture and conservation principles. Next slide, please. So the next time round, we really made use of Geoffrey's kind of experience, and we integrated his teaching on conservation architecture into his technical module, and also across into the context module, where students were writing about their work and doing kind of geometric analysis and understanding of the building structures. So we did that, and for our project, we focused on this site, which is the Priory Gatehouse in Worksop, a building which Geoffrey had worked on in the past, as well as the adjacent Priory building. The need there was this difficult upkeep. The live client was the Priory themselves. It's on the edge of a deprived area and high level of crime, and parts of the building were being used in ways that weren't intended, shall we say. Next slide. So the brief was for the adaptive reuse of the covered passageway linking to a new extension to the building. The students had to develop their own ideas for what the community need by doing a study of the surrounding area. On reflection, that's probably too advanced for second years to be writing their own briefs. And as I say, the client was as owners were keen to see the problems with security solved, but we also integrated into the brief the display, public display of certain elements from the Priory's archive to better sort of interpret the site. Okay, next slide. So outcomes then. The students were perhaps too concerned about the sensitivity of the existing fabric. In fact, if you look at this Priory Gatehouse, although it's grade 1 listed, there had been previous interventions in its history. So we tried to explain the new intervention as part of a process of actual continual change. However, a lot of the students ended up with a sort of plug-in approach to extensions. They were additions and on, and they shied away from touching the existing fabric. Next slide, please. In contrast, the Strongest Schemes developed this clear program of new uses meeting that community need. So those students who did move on to that really engaged with the interior of the building as well, and how the spaces would flow between the existing adaptive reuse and the new extension building. Okay, next slide, please. So the comparison of these two then, the listing of the Priory Gatehouse was a big advantage in that they could clearly identify the heritage value, and their interventions were more sensitive to that heritage value. However, the old school hall was probably more successful in having that live community need with the live clients and not requiring the students to come up with their own new uses here. Interventions then were more adaptive and engaged in the old school hall project. But the grade 1 listing we felt was probably a hindrance and a restraint. Next slide, please. So for the next project, we moved on to this building, which is a Great Northern Railway former corn warehouse. Grade 2 listed, but severely damaged by fire, and part of a master plan for redevelopment, which again, a new use for this building was very difficult to find, and it's under threat of demolition. Next slide, please. In this case, we looked to a live client, and locally there was a skate park who were being kicked out of their existing building, something the students could get their hands on in terms of a kind of contemporary urban culture being introduced to a heritage setting. And we used that idea of urban culture revitalizing heritage buildings as the basis for a third-year research project in their context studies, looking at architectural heritage and urban culture, during which they studied what the second-year students were doing. So there's a kind of a process of moving that learning up through the years. Next slide, please. So the key features of the project design here was that there was a clear listed status and a threat, which we'd learned from the previous things. There was a live client who was relatable to the student. The observation by student peers helped to sort of reinforce the thinking for the second years about what they were doing. And we continue to integrate that learning into the other modules about conservation principles and technology. Next slide, please. So in terms of outcomes, we had many more bold spatial interventions that it works up, which we thought was important. And there were fewer insensitive alterations and additions at the old school hall. So making progress on that, and the principles of kind of reversibility and questions over authenticity were quite easy to introduce in this case, because we had this link up between the authenticity of skateboarding and urban culture and the authenticity of the architectural heritage. There was a kind of a consideration of the value of both of those and how they came together. Next slide, please. This was further taken on by Jeffrey into a subsequent project, which looked in more detail about the interfaces between the new and the old. Next slide, please. So this is about the third year project. They reflected well on the observation methodology that they were using with the second year students. They took the notion of authenticity and applied it well through the urban culture, and they built on their own learning. So these were students who had done the Worksop Priory project, and then in the subsequent year kind of returned to the theme of heritage adaptation. Next slide, please. So the most recent iteration of the project, then the fourth year that we're running it, we again used the GNR building, but finding a live client and indeed visiting the site live was very difficult under the pandemic conditions. So we instead evolved a loose fit brief. So this was really about saying we don't know what's going to happen to the economy, society, everything after the pandemic. So how do we design without mothballing this structure, which is in imminent danger of collapse? How do we design something in there that might be appropriate for a number of different future scenarios? So without the live client, trying to make things kind of topical to the situation that the students were following. And they had that sort of flexibility then to design something which would have future relevance. Next slide, please. Initial reflections on that then. The students developed a great understanding of the building geometry than they had for the skate park projects before it, and more understanding of the structure. So a lot of the projects related more to the picking up on clues from the existing building and integrating the new to the old. The project on the right there, for example, picked up on the pattern of 3 bays in the roof, but introduced a kind of a modern frame structure in place of the old cast iron structure that had been lost. But there was, in contrast, a kind of reduced grasp of the functional brief requirements. So again, that loose fit brief, a little bit too advanced probably for for second years. Next slide, please. So to having this sort of accidental repetition of the same GNR project with 2 different briefs gives us an opportunity to think about that, giving the heritage room to breathe and the advantages and disadvantages there probably. So the live project, the first one we did, was more realistic in terms of engaging a kind of awkward brief with the existing building. However, the loose fit brief of the subsequent year allowed the students to pay more attention to the nature and potential of the existing structure, with the drawback that it was probably too loose. The other thing that happened was, unfortunately, in this year, we were unable to repeat that 3rd year research project. So having kind of introduced this by stealth and just kind of done it, probably our vulnerability is that it now needs to be embedded in the curriculum in order to ensure that this kind of vertical integration happens, whether or not we're there to kind of maintain it in the future. Next slide, please. So to sum up, looking at the overall sort of outcomes, coming back to this idea of a successful second year studio design project, these are our recommendations. So if we take the idea that you should have a clear and urgent set of needs to be met, our recommendation is that a project of this nature should have a clear, recognized heritage status and preferably be under threat. We don't want buildings to be under threat, but it gives that kind of urgency to the project, which I think motivates students. In terms of having an engageable and approachable challenge, the listed status of the building needs to be there, but not be too intimidating to actually put second year or undergraduate students off. In terms of having a body of knowledge to be integrated, then the essential aspect is this teaching integration between different modules, I suppose. So teaching of conservation theory, policy, and techniques. In terms of relevance to the designer and the future roles, then really what's been successful for us is either having a live project with relatable clients or having a kind of topical brief that's of the moment. So the typical kind of project of putting a museum or a library perhaps into a heritage building might not quite switch the students on to the design potential there. And then the thoughtful sequence of tasks is this thing about repetition of learning opportunities vertically throughout the course. Next slide, please. I think that's where we're going to leave you. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to present, and thanks to Yaste.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey and Tom, for a fascinating presentation. So we now have about a little bit over 35 minutes, so we have time for some questions. I would actually like to begin by asking a couple broader questions and comments. There are many really interesting intersections between the 4 presentations, really, and I believe that there actually can be very productive conversation. I'd like to begin maybe by asking our presenters to comment. This actually came out much more in the last presentation. The general pedagogy in design through the kind of works that you're doing, either through the use of new technologies or collaborations with craftsmen or integrations with new knowledge or traditional knowledge, dealing with uncertainty. How does that sort of transform the kind of disciplinary collective in design? I think there is something to be said in there that is very interesting. The other comment question is, I think some of the presentation are implicit in suggesting the response to sustainability, kind of use of resources. So these larger questions addressing the urban future and some of the challenges we're facing. Maybe especially, I think in Gerald and Yenny's presentations are these amazing craft technologies that I was wondering if you could articulate a little bit maybe more about the new values of these practices, but also for all the speakers. So maybe I could ask the speakers to maybe quick response, and then we'll address the questions.
Perhaps I can pick up on the second question first, if that's okay. I think that in terms of response to sustainability, I think there's an enormous number of technical challenges in terms of rehabilitation of existing buildings that we need to face. So I think introducing those issues early in the curriculum again is important. But we found the kind of loose fit ideas around this sort of 3 L's, the kind of long life, low energy, and loose fit, to be quite useful for the students, a way of going beyond seeing sustainability as simply being about low energy, but also about building for a long life and building for future adaptability. So I thought those are some useful principles in terms of sustainability.
Great, thank you.
Can I pick up on the pedagogy issue? I mean, Hyun Jun and I actually run a design studio together, and I've been using techniques of film and animation in the sort of teaching of an MArch Part 2, RIBA Part 2 course now for over 20 years. And I've always felt that one of the constraints about using traditional forms of representation is that it doesn't actually allow people from outside of architecture to really understand what's going on. So using film and time-based techniques is a much better way of communicating ideas. And it's also a good way of teaching students skills as well. So a lot of my students have quite sort of advanced skills in the use of kind of software that goes beyond just traditional CAD or 3D modeling techniques. So what we're doing with this kind of scanning projects is for us a kind of an extension of that. It's about developing narratives to kind of communicate beyond specialist audiences. And one of the really interesting outcomes of the exhibition that we held in Huddersfield was the number of people who kind of, ordinary people, because it was the gallery that we showed in was located in a kind of market space, but people were coming in and, they understood, or they kind of understood the sort of layering and the kind of juxtaposition of the spaces that we were trying to create. And so for us, this sort of is part of a much broader way in which we can sort of break down the sort of professional ways in which we rely on certain forms of orthographic production which are kind of alienating to non-specialist audiences. And it's through this kind of emphasis on a narrative approach to the way in which we kind of integrate our research and our teaching.
Great, certainly. Does Gerald and Yenny have maybe a quick response before we go into inviting others to ask questions?
Gerald, please
Gerald,
you're mute.
Sorry about that. Debbie Whelan, who's in the audience, knows much more about this than I do, because I withdrew from architectural teaching and I now specialize in research methodology. But what I can tell you in the broadest sense, in the South African architectural teaching, the whole concept of a decolonized curriculum is now on the forefront of the debate. And then, of course, we've got to ask, what is it a decolonized curriculum? And what does it include? What does it exclude? And we cannot ignore the international, let's say, that's why I used the word twice, internationalized agenda. But at the same time, we've got to orientate ourselves, that means the white architects and our students, to the indigenous knowledge systems in building. And that has been neglected for a very, very long time. And even now, we don't have in South Africa many of the villages like they have in Botswana, for example. So to really get a grasp of what African space is about and traditional space is about, you've got to travel. And I've been doing that for many decades now, and I really enjoyed it. But I suggest that it must be part of the curriculum, because now it's just an add-on to, I think it's a bit artificial. And the whole South African learning and teaching of architecture must be revised, and we'll have to do it fairly soon. Debbie might add to that. She's more eloquent than I am.
Okay, great. Yanni?
Okay, maybe I will describe something about the new pedagogy. I think from what I learned about introducing materials and joinery by learning by making, it opens up imagination and creativity beyond drawings. So first year students of architecture, usually in Indonesia, they don't understand the structural logic. So it's quite difficult to teach them about the structural logic. But by learning by making, they understand and they draw better. So if you look at the drawings that so we ask them to draw after they build, because they understand the technical drawing are better. And in terms of values, they develop a new respect and curiosity on tradition, especially about techniques, how traditional buildings are constructed.
We have quite a few questions actually raised hands. So I'll start with Yusuf.
Hi, thank you. I was amazed by all the presentations. They were all fantastic, and I'm interested in all of them equally. I have 2 points. One of them is kind of an echoing of the presentation of Nick, and the other is a question for Jeffrey and Tom. So the first kind of echoing what Nick has said in the presentation, because you've already mentioned how laser scanning is perceived as a quantitative tool, but you showed that it's much more than that. And I'd like to also add that there are many projects, including ones that I've worked on, that they show that it's a lot more than that. They uncover stories, they show hidden spaces, and they show these interactions in places that have been forgotten in heritage sites. For example, there was a site in Jordan in which the locals have been interacting with for ages, but it's only with the 3D scanning, when the locals saw it, they were like, oh yeah, we did this in that area, and we did this in that area, and that then helped some inform some methodology for analyzing qualitative data. So I think the opportunities for laser scanning is very immense, and I just wanted to, because I'm very fascinated by it and by your presentation, Nick, so I just wanted to add to that point.
Can I make a response to that? Because one of the things is I don't want to underestimate the quantitative opportunities of it. When you and I were at Greenwich, and we scanned a very kind of a space you probably will be familiar with, but not from having gone there, but from seeing it in movies. It's the Painted Hall, which is part of the Old Royal Naval College. And from the scans, we were able to sort of detect a kind of structural system that was used to hold up the internal arch that wasn't actually documented in the way in which the building process had been described historically. So, you know, I like telling stories with scanning, because, you know, part of my interest has been about using the kind of moving image, but I don't want to underestimate or neglect the really important aspect that scanning brings to us as a kind of surveying tool as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just highlighting that shouldn't be dismissed as a tool only for surveyors. It should be a bit more than that. And the second point, which is kind of intertwined, it's not really, but I'll make it work. It's to Jeffrey and Tom. So I've been lucky enough to work with you guys for the past 2 years. It's been amazing. But I think there's a question that always comes to my mind when it comes to how do we make students care about conservation? So we talked about in the presentation, you talked about all the kind of ways that we're trying to do that right now. But one example that came to my mind is in medicine students, in which when they do their anatomy class, they tell them the story of the body that they're trying to to cut up, because it makes them relate to them. It makes them care more about the body, not just cut it up and play with it. And in the same way, how do we kind of utilize kind of these stories and make them relatable as possible to the students as they should care about, without actually being architecture students? Should it be related to their home communities, or should it be like buildings that we will tell them the story of, and then they will become more invested in it? And maybe the use of technology like 3D scanning would get them more interested in conservation, because it's conservation to them, from my conversations with them anyway, is that they think it's more of a kind of an old people's thing. But in reality, one of them came to the office that I work in, and we had a 3D scanner, and they were fascinated by all the 3D scanning images and what is the 3D scanner. So integrating that tool, is there any opportunities for that, and how do we make them care in general?
Lots to go on there. Thanks, Yusuf. I think that, yeah, new technology and I try to emphasize this aspect of making things kind of culturally relevant for, you know, contemporary society and their lives, and all of that is really, really important to show that it's not about preservation of something that's no longer relevant. It's about giving old buildings new life and a relevance. And yeah, I think responding to that is important. I think there's a lot of potential for scanning. I was going to ask Nick about we've made use of some virtual reality headsets, for example, this year, because obviously going and understanding the artifact that you have already on the site is an incredibly important part of it. And students not being able to do that has been an incredible challenge to the projects that we run. And we've tried to replace that by giving them virtual tours with me wearing a VR headset and walking around the real building while they instruct me what to look at and to point at and go and touch and feel or smell or experience. And I was going to ask Nick about whether there's, you know, you showed the presentation of your work in a sort of 2D or 3D environments and projections, but whether you'd use that or explore the potential of presenting things through VR as a way of exploring virtual space.
Well, we actually got into scanning really through interest in VR and AR and extended reality. So yeah, it's part of the kind of whole process of ways in which we can kind of you know, immerse ourselves in the kind of representations. And I suppose, you know, I was taught by a man called Robin Evans, who was one of the first people who wrote a very kind of focused critique of traditional forms of representation. So I've always had a certain kind of suspicion about the kind of traditional use of orthography and the way in which we imply so many things about it. So this is part of a whole kind of research project. We've got a fantastic facility in the University of Huddersfield in our new building, which I'm sitting in front of, an image of that, called the Create Lab, where we have a very kind of sophisticated sort of cave setup and also things like 3D motion capture. So there's a whole series of ways in which I'm looking at this technology across quite a broad spectrum.
Right, thank you.
Just add something to what Yusuf was asking about creating the interest for students, Yusuf. We have them do a lot of research before they even put, pencil to paper, so to speak, to look at what the community uses of the building was, what relevance it had to the community, obviously looking at historic mapping, so all these various things. So they start reading the story of the building themselves, which very often will then inspire what they do design-wise.
Something I'd like to do with that GNR building, for example, would be the virtual reconstruction of the building that has been lost and burnt down because it was valued for its incredible structure. So yeah, there's a lot of potential there.
We have 3 more raised hands here, so maybe we'll look back to the continued conversation. So Bernadette.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentations. They were very interesting. My comment is for the first presentation and related to the comment that Yusuf just made. When many people are using this tool of three laser scanning for in-depth study methodology and not just as a surveying tool. You mentioned that this tool has been around for more than 20 years, but actually it's way longer than that. It's just been used more recently. My question is how your approach inserts or relates to existing discourses on the use of 3D laser scanning for representing architecture, for exhibitions, for intervention in built heritage, etc., led by ScanLab projects, for example, who started using this tool 10 years ago, or the academics at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, or even here, the Center for Architecture, Urbanism and Global Heritage, NTU.
Sorry, sorry for smiling, but I said that I first got interested in scanning 20 years ago. A friend of mine showed me some images of he was running a scanning company, and they'd taken these images. He'd been employed by British Nuclear Fuels to scan for defects inside a nuclear reactor, and I was completely blown away by that, by the images that I saw and the potential of those images. And I was teaching at the Bartlett at that time. I'd been teaching there for quite a number of years and was running an MArch unit there. And I wrote a research proposition at the Bartlett in about 2003, 2004. And I couldn't get any funding for it because no one saw the real potential for it. About 5 years later, my research proposal was used to get some seed funding for a project that became ScanLab. And one of the criticisms was when the sort of funding was sent out was that it was about 5 years out of date. And I said, well, yes, I know it was 5 years out of date because I wrote it 5 years ago. Unfortunately, when ScanLab was established, I kind of was moved. I wasn't then encouraged to take part in it. So when you mention ScanLab, that has a certain kind of Schadenfreude in my case. And I left the Bartlett in 2011 to move to Greenwich. But I mean, I see where we are with scanning at the moment. It's a very similar situation. If you look at the kind of things like the history of photography, and you look at kind of photography around about the time that people like Daguerre were using it, and the way in which it's still, difficult to use. The equipment's expensive. It requires quite a lot of CPU power to be able to develop the images. But all of those processes were changing. And I recently did get an iPhone 12 Pro with the scanning app on it. And again, that has limitations. Hyunjun and I run sort of workshops with our students using photogrammetry to develop point cloud models. I just think it's a really, really kind of exciting time to be using this technology. And I've seen some of the work that you've done and that you did at the Bartlett. So I'm aware of things like the kind of 3D scan house that you made. And I think, again, this opportunity to sort of use it, not just in a kind of to record and document spaces, but by converting the data into sort of mesh models and using them much more as part of the design process. I think it's something that we're going to be becoming more and more much more kind of common. I mean, I remember when I first started using digital technology at the Bartlett in the mid-1990s, there was so much kind of skepticism towards that it will never replace proper drawings. And of course, at that time, a lot of the tutors didn't even realize that students were actually doing all their design work on digital tools and then redrawing them, just because the tutors wanted that kind of level of authenticity. And I must admit, with the way in which authenticity was used in a lot of the presentations, I sometimes have a slight kind of issue with that, because I think we should always pluralize it, because there is no singular authenticity, but a range of authenticities. So I've forgotten your question, but I think it's a really exciting field to be working in, across a whole different kind of spectrum. But the thing that, what I'm trying to do at the moment is about, I mean, Huddersfield's in a very kind of interesting situation, and my involvement with the town is around Huddersfield trying to develop new narratives about its own self, what it becomes you know, once having been a kind of an industrial centre, it's now kind of almost a sort of a commuter town for Manchester and Leeds. So how we tell different types of story about it by scanning the existing buildings or filming the buildings or using drones or, you know, capturing that information, but then editing and reusing that information in a whole range of different ways. You know, and I'm working with some really, one of the things that Hyun reminded me in the chat when I was answering the previous question was that we're working with this fantastic researcher who's in our kind of engineering department, who's doing some really amazing things with capturing 3D sound. So we're also not just capturing the visual spaces, but the auditory spaces of those environments as well. And, you know, we can use Hyun Cook's software to kind of to construct the actual kind of sound characteristics of those kind of spaces. And you know, I just find it such an exciting area to be working in at the moment. I probably answered about 6 different questions there, and I'm not sure that I answered your original question, but I'm hoping that kind of my enthusiasm allows me to get away with it.
It's very exciting to hear you. Let's get to our next question by Stuart.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I also work at Nottingham Trent University, and Tom and Jeffrey, if you've not done it so far, you could maybe talk to my colleagues in the history department, because it's history and heritage. So trying to get a male undergraduate student who's chosen history because he wants to do the Nazis and the Cold War to study heritage, they face a similar challenge. And I wondered also, the GNR building, the architect is T.C. Hine. So I wondered if you could maybe get the students to grow in confidence by taking them to see what T.C. Hine did at the castle, because you've got an example there of adaptive reuse, which is not exactly wonderfully successful in terms of the flooring and the incorporation of the extant building. So that was my first point. And the second thing I just wanted to ask everyone, you use words like vernacular, democracy, heritage. And I find it interesting that when these come up against new technologies, so when photography was new, someone like Fox Talbot went to Trafalgar Square and took pictures, and it's a bit of a shame really, because the photos he took, you stand on the same spot and they almost look the same today. So I wonder whether using all this fancy technology to do 3D scans of castles and listed buildings, wouldn't it be better to scan really bad buildings, structurally unsound, inferior materials, inadequate safety? Because if you think about Britain, the Grenfell Tower fire, 2017, it killed 72 people, and then thousands of Britons realized that they're living in appallingly built, unsafe homes. So if they were 3D scanned, this kind of anti-heritage that will never be preserved, but that's what is relevant today. And I think that that is likely to be an invaluable record for the future.
Any response from our presenters?
Just thanks for the ideas, Stuart, and the context. I think I've recently discovered that the GNR building roof structure is similar to the Nottingham, what's now the Nottingham College, the Adams building in the Lace Market, which so going and having a look at the technology of that will help, I think. Thanks, Stuart.
I mean, I want to say that although out of the three projects that I showed in this presentation, and obviously our scanning project is also looking at a lot of the kind of more quotidian buildings of Huddersfield. But one of them is a 1970s brutalist building, part of which has an amazing kind of concrete structure, but part of it is also showing the kind of decline and the ordinariness of it. And I think that when we're talking about some of the issues around the problems of contemporary building, I think you're right that this technology allows us to inhabit these things and talk about them and you know, discuss those kind of problems more kind of closely. But I think also that the issues around that arose from Grenfell also come about by wider kind of problems about, you know, the nature of the urban environment in a kind of era of neoliberalism, where building stops being something that's seen as part of a kind of living experience, but also just becomes part of an investment portfolio or something that is going to be the potential of an investment portfolio.
Question from Debbie. Sorry, I've been waiting for a while.
That's absolutely fine. It depends if I can remember what I was going to say. So I think I wanted to reinforce what Gerald was saying. What is really important for most of the people in this conference is that the new types of knowledge coming out of the African experience cannot be underrated. And I think what is really important for me to be able to say is that absolutely, Gerald and I both studied in South Africa. We both studied under a sort of quasi-modernist tradition. But one of the things which has happened in the last 25 years is that we've all, as white and black South Africans, had to continually rethink and reposition ourselves in terms of every single value system that we hold. And it's exactly the same for architecture. And I think that this is where it starts to become keenly important, is that the understanding of buildings or the built environment in African society is, as Gerald put it, spot on, is about space. It's about the interpretation of space, whereas the building, the materiality, is something which is ephemeral. And that is in complete opposite to the European examples or the European understandings of tangibility and the material. And the tangibility, intangibility, material and space are these dichotomies, which as architects in South Africa, we work with constantly all the time. At the same time, as he also keenly pointed out, there is a very real opportunity or risk of Disneyfication. And we've also got to check ourselves to decide whether the Disneyfication is okay or not. Yesterday, I presented a whole series of buildings which people would absolutely laugh at in the architectural profession because they do not fit in with the elite understandings of architecture, but they are socially negotiated and they are acceptable by many millions of people across the southern part of the continent. So I think that the acceptability for flux and living in other people's worlds is absolutely vital in rapidly changing worlds. So thank you for letting me just be able to reinforce some of his points.
Gerald, do you have anything to add?
I told you Debbie is more eloquent than I am. She explained it so nicely.
So we have a question from Barry. I have to unmute you, I think.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, still struggling with technology. Yeah, no, I was particularly struck by Yenny's talk. I loved the idea of students interacting with local vernacular builders and craftspeople, and I think this is 100% correct. And I loved the description, the appropriate description of the local craftspeople as experts, because that's what they are. They might not have letters after their name, but they're absolutely experts. I think it's 100% correct. At the moment, actually, I'm working on finalizing a 3-year strategy for, as we called it, understanding, minding, and handing on vernacular built heritage in Ireland. And one of the things we definitely want to bring into it in year 3, which is about 23-24, is to upskill local builders in particular and empower house owners to do their own repairs and so on. So we want to try, if you like, sort of deprofessionalize or maybe professionalize the owners and so on. But I have my question then I have a question for Jenny and a question for Jeffrey and Tom, if that's okay. The question for Jenny is your program the first to teach engagement with local vernacular builders? And for Jeffrey and Tom, what proportion of students drop out after year one of their undergraduate studies? And if that figure is high, would it be preferable to introduce conservation in year one?
Sorry, I didn't quite get your question. Your question
is your program the first to teach engagement with local vernacular builders and craftspeople for student architects?
First, what do you mean first?
Is your program exceptional? Do other universities?
Yes, this is the first program. Yes, this is the first program that we try to execute, which because of the pandemic, we cannot do for these 2 years.
Okay.
Okay, are there any other questions?
I have that question for Jeffrey and Tom, which is about the teaching of conservation. If many students drop out after year one, could conservation be shunted forward into year one? That's my question.
There is a high dropout rate of students after year one. I think sort of across, not unique to our course, but the students who struggle to engage perhaps with the subject as it is at architecture school compared to what people's expectations are of what they will undertake. Whether or not the earlier introduction of conservation architecture would help, I don't know. Potentially, because the broader you are, the wider the chances are that you will engage different students at that stage. We certainly do have projects in our first year studio which deal with existing and heritage contexts. So it's not by any means kind of like greenfield site building as an object in space, but buildings within the heritage areas of the city, for example, and some that involve building around the ruins of existing buildings as well. So it does already feature. It's an interesting question that I'll take forward. Would it reduce our dropout rate? Interesting. Thank you.
Great. Everybody,
you're on mute, Jeffrey, I think.
Jeffrey?
Sorry, yep, there it works now, I hope. Yes, Barry, I mean, the other thing is in their context course, they're learning a lot about architectural history. They're taken to sites to see historic buildings and things around the UK. So it is there, but we're not sort of focusing on it as a discipline at the moment. That starts to come more in second year. But you're absolutely right. Maybe there are other ways we could bring it in.
Great, thank you, everybody. So now it's 9 already. Well, it's 9 o'clock here. Actually, it is the end of the session time, but hopefully some of the discussions can be carried on beyond the session. So we would like to bring it to a close. I'd like to thank our 4 speakers again for presentations and our speakers again for a very interesting set of presentations. And also for all of our attendees of the sessions for being here. I have to point out Christakis.
Yes, I could just apologize. Yes,
sorry,
yeah.
We missed you. So we decided we just have 4 papers, but you, so we
no problem.
Accommodate you. Apologize. Otherwise, I'm sure.
No. It's no problem. I don't know why, but in one of the programs that I had, we were supposed to start at 12 o'clock your time. It's 2 o'clock our time. And then when I just checked today, it was 2 o'clock until 4 o'clock. So we thought it was 4 o'clock our local time, so we missed it. We apologize. I don't know how I got 2 versions of the same program. So my apologies.
I'm sorry. Well,
Okay.
we get to see you. So I just want to remind everyone the closing sessions will be on in 30 minutes. So hopefully everybody will join. And this session will be recorded, and so it will be made available on the website after the conference events. So thank you again, everyone, for joining the really interesting sessions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.